Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Civic Honours Subcommittee. The evacuation for agenda item number 1 is as printed. As everyone knows what we have to do in the event of a fire alarm going off, I don't propose to read it. Safe to say, follow me out the door. That leads us on to agenda item 2, which is apologies. I've had apologies from Councillor Watkins and Councillor Jill Shepherd is substituting, and Councillor Golby is running late. She's stuck in traffic. That leads us on to agenda item number 3, which is the minutes of the last meeting. Is everyone happy that I sign them as a true and accurate record of the meeting? Thank you. Thank you very much. Item number 4 is to receive declarations of interest. Are there any declarations not already printed in the agenda that are relevant to today's meeting? No. Okay. Oh, go on, Councillor Shepherd.
Apologies, Chair. My declarations aren't in this paperwork. I was just checking. So it's the Management Committee of the Mental Health Drop-In, Director of Wembrook Community Centre and HTC Partnership Member. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Shepherd. That leads us on to agenda item number 5, which is public consultation. We have a statement from Mr. Sam Margrave, which will be read out by Director Richardson. Phil?
Thank you, Chair. This is a statement from Mr. Margrave to the Leader of the Council. Before raising this, I wanted to seek resolution to the lack of a street for Sergeant Valentine, and I'm grateful for the response of the Leader of the Council at the last Council meeting, despite the Leader explaining the obstacles to renaming a street previously. I am calling on civic leaders to explore if it might be possible to rename the section of Rye Peace Ringway to Frank Parsons Parade or Frank Parsons Way, as this is where Bedworth, the Peace Podium, to take the salute on Remembrance Sunday and Armistice Day. Part of the A444 was renamed to Jimmy Hill Way, so this is possible. This would be a great way to mark the man who made Bedworth the town that never forgets, and gives us a change to include Frank and his memory as part of the parade for future generations. I've also posted on community forums and spoken to residents. Although entirely unscientific, no one was against, and there is huge support for this. I also have the backing of the chairman of the Armistice Committee, which I am a member of. This isn't a political campaign. I have no intention of seeking election, so I want all parties and none to support this. For me, this is about doing the right thing, and something I argued with the previous administration about. As a Bedworth lad, I want my hometown to really be the town that never forgets. Without Frank, the Armistice Parade wouldn't be in existence today. He kept it going when others forgot the Armistice. He was also a prisoner of war. Frank is a legend in the town and led the parade and chaired the committee. While we do it to remember those who have fallen or served today, it would be nice for future generations and in his memory to have Frank as part of the parade again, and the section of roadway in front of the saluting rostrum to the ex-servicemen's club is the perfect location for such a change. We therefore, as leader of our borough, support such a change and take action to make this happen, or with the mayor organise a meeting with local MPs, the leader of the county council and representatives of the forces community and organisations, including myself, to explore if it might be possible to rename the section of Rye Peace Ringway Frank Parsons Way, as this is where Bedworth, the Peace Podium, to take the salute on Remembrance Sunday and Armistice Day. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Phil. I won't give too many comments on the statement, as I'll be addressing something about that under any other items. But what I would say is that whilst I appreciate there is support for this from various organisations, I believe that first and foremost the support and permission has to come from the family or the estate of Frank Parsons to begin with, because I think it is only appropriate to take their views into account in any such thing. If they do, and this is the same answer I gave in relation to Sergeant Valentine at full council, then I don't see any particular impediment to doing as has been suggested, subject to any other legal checks, etc. But I will come on to that under any other items. So that leads us on to agenda item number 6, which is the street naming and numbering report. Do you wish to highlight anything, Mr. Richardson?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things. Obviously, this was raised at the last meeting of the subcommittee, and hence the report has been brought to this subcommittee for you to consider. Specifically, the key thing that I think the subcommittee were interested in was a policy that would allow for the naming of a living individual rather than somebody that has to have deceased. So if you turn to page 21 of the appendix, which is appended to the report, you'll see that the penultimate bullet point there has been struck out. That is the requirement that says that we shouldn't include living individuals. Now, that in itself would achieve your stated aim. However, I think I've shaded out further up on page 21 a section of the third paragraph there, which obviously will need to be amended to reflect that. And so I would suggest that you need to add some words in to say something along the lines of, with the exception of those recommended by this subcommittee, as a preamble to the rest of that you wouldn't necessarily change names to living individuals unless it was something that this subcommittee recommended. But that's entirely up to the subcommittee to decide. And the other change I've picked up, obviously the paragraph immediately above that, I've taken that out principally because clearly it says there's no right of appeal when in fact there is, so we can't really exclude that through the policy. Other than that, Chair, the only other thing I wanted to mention was on page 16, the policy, when it was amended in June last year, made a change which was contrary to a previous policy decision that was taken in 2008, which was to adopt the 1925 Act. And I don't think without, we can have a policy that reverts back to the 1907 Act without there being a formal decision to do so and a formal process, because of course there is a formal adoption procedure that has to be followed. However, for reasons that I'll explain in a second, I think by reinserting the Public Health Act 1925 actually goes further towards achieving part of your aim, which is that if you want to rename a street, and I know you were discussing a possibility around Rowan Ringway, for example, the procedure for doing that is, shall we say, simpler under the 1925 Act than it is under the 1907 Act, principally because under the 1907 Act you need to poll any residents that live on that street or have an address on that street, and you need a 2/3 majority in favour of the change before you can implement it, whereas under the 1925 Act you don't have to go through that procedure. There is an appeal process, but as is always the case, that procedure does give you a bit more latitude to do things and then argue the case if need be before the magistrates on appeal.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So I have some amendments that I would like to suggest to the policy as printed. So on page 21, where you have the highlighted changing, and it's the third paragraph down, changing a street name, etc. At the end of that sentence, have a comma, and then with the exception of any recommendation of the Civic Honours Subcommittee, which I think would address the point that you raise. And then on page 22, there are some amendments that I would like to move there. So on the first sub-bullet point, where the person has been deceased for a minimum of 10 years, delete from written, and delete from written to the end of the sentence and say, and all practical efforts to obtain consent have been made. Because it may be that there are no family left, or the estate of the person is no longer available or contactable, or they may themselves be deceased. To add underneath that as another sub-paragraph, sub-bullet point, where the person has been deceased for less than 10 years, subject to all practical efforts to obtain consent having been made, the request shall be considered by the Civic Honours Subcommittee. Because, for example, if we take Sergeant Valentine or Fusilier Carter, the family may have wished, I think they actually did wish less than 10 years to make such a request, but under the policy as currently written, that would be prohibited. But I think if it is a person who's been deceased for less than 10 years, then this committee would be the appropriate body to do that. Then, where we have the deceased person must have served the community, etc., so the last sub-bullet point, delete or after community and replace with a comma, have a local affiliation to the area or be a figure of national significance. So, as written, I would interpret that sentence prohibiting naming something after, say, Prince Philip or Her Majesty the Queen, Churchill, for example. You couldn't, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think he actually visited Nuneaton and Bedworth, but it may be that someone wanted to do an estate named after former prime ministers or someone else, or authors. I know there is an author's estate in Galley Common, but if they are more recent authors, that may be prohibited, because you can't really argue that, except for George Eliot, any author really has a connection. Oh, there are others accepted, but George Eliot is the most famous one. And then, finally, to try and introduce a safeguard about living persons, introduce a separate bullet point underneath street names are unacceptable, etc., where it would say, any proposed street name concerning a living person shall be referred to the Civic Honours Subcommittee for consideration. And I think that provides a safeguard on that front and an element of democratic oversight as well. So, subject to those amendments, I will move the report from the chair. Does that receive a seconder? Councillor Croft, and I see Councillor Tromans was keen to second as well. Any member wish to speak? Councillor Shepherd.
I do have a couple of concerns about this document, and one being the lack of criteria. I have mentioned it to Philip already, to decide how people are picked. Because if you get two people, you've got one building, two people wishing that name to be used, and then you are in a situation then where you've got two people who you might wish to be named on only one building to do it with no criteria to back that up. I would not like to think that this council would be accused of cronyism in putting names forward. I've already got concerns over ex-councillors' names being put in because there was no criteria behind that either. So I do have real concerns that actually we've missed a step in terms of the criteria setting to make it easy for members who sit on this committee to decide, but also I think as a safeguard. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Shepherd. I have Councillor Tromans and Councillor Croft.
Thank you, Chair. I think what Councillor Shepherd was referring to was showing preference or preferential treatment rather than cronyism. That's a different thing. it appears that what the councillor's looking for is a tick box, a list of, if somebody has done X, Y, and Z, then they get it. If they've been hanging around long enough, or been a councillor long enough, or been whatever long enough, and that's just not how we or the public want to recognise people. I think the whole idea of having an elected council to represent people and people's views, and to have a committee drawn from that, is that they will make a decision based on the merits at the time. And I think to come up with some kind of algorithm and checklist that would, make that decision for us, in effect, negates the whole democratic process, and it would be fiendishly complicated. Or it would be very simple and, just people that had been around the longest, and that's not really what this is about. So I think it's unlikely we're going to get many situations where two people are up for the same building or whatever, but I think it's quite within the wit of the committee or the council to make a fair and reasonable determination reflecting the view of the people that have elected us. And I think to put any more constraints on it than that is to abrogate that responsibility. So I couldn't support that, Chair. I think elected representatives have to decide, not have a kind of a checklist, do it for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tromans. Councillor Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I agree with Councillor Tromans, and I shall politely disagree with Councillor Shepherd. The whole point of this sort of committee is that members do decide. There is a very worrying trend in public life today, which is just to sort of offshore everything onto a sort of set of principles and rules, and elected members and elected governments like to box themselves in and have very little scope to make actual decisions, and the whole point of an elected government is to make decisions. Councillor Shepherd, I think can be reassured slightly, because one of the principles of public life is objectivity. You might have your political principles and ideology, and I'm something of an ideologue, but you do have to approach things as objectively as possible. It's not just cronyism and handing things out to your mates, and there is an appeals process. So if you find that if you find that you don't like somebody, then you can certainly take through an appeals process. And this is why I'm very pleased with this report, actually, because we've taken out the 1907 Act and given ourselves more agency to make decisions based on political principles and haggle things out and approach things objectively, as opposed to what might be set in stone by I can't think of the right word, by a previous set of principles, and that couldn't be argued over. So I think that it is important that we allow ourselves that freedom to roam. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Croft. Just addressing some of the points, I think the building issue is actually relatively easy to resolve, because the building would presumably have an owner, and the building owner would need to consent to the naming of a building or a company, which would have a method of doing that, whereas street names are strictly the purview of the council. So I don't particularly see that being an issue. And as Councillor Croft quite rightly highlighted, there is an inbuilt appeal mechanism to the Magistrates' Court in that instance. And I have to apologise in some respects to Councillor Shepherd, but I reject the argument of cronyism. This report isn't about the aldermanships which were passed at the last committee. Labour had an opportunity to be represented, and there was no representation. All of those who have been put forward have served their communities with distinction. The statutory provisions in terms of considering who should be awarded were considered by this committee. And if we are being honest with ourselves, the biggest method of cronyism in this council until the change of administration was who sat in this chair as mayor. And only one Conservative councillor in all the years that Labour had control of this council was mayor, when there were numerous other councillors on the opposition benches who served just as long, if not longer, made just as many contributions to public life, if not more, than some of the inhabitants of this chair. And to add insult to injury, a number of mayors were recycled. Now, I'm all for recycling, But I think it is deeply, deeply unfair that someone is precluded from serving as the first citizen of this borough by virtue of the party that they represent, when someone is having that honour twice, or indeed, as we were in the run-up to the last election, potentially 3 times. This wasn't a war scenario like in the 1940s where one mayor served for 5 years, or the pandemic scenario where former councillor Tandy served for 2 years out of necessity. So I will take no lessons in cronyism from any of the opposition, given how I know a number of people who would have been extremely deserving of sitting in this chair as mayor. We had the late, great Des O'Brien, we had Neil College, we had Harry Cawthorne, to name just a few. And they would have been terrific mayors of this borough, but they were denied it by the cronyism of the party opposite. And I find that deeply disturbing, particularly when even the Labour stronghold of Coventry can bring it itself to actually alternate the mayoralty. So I don't have any truck with that argument whatsoever. And on a personal level, and having known those people for a long period of time, I find that very painful that they didn't get to have that honour. So I will return us to the report before us. Can we take it to a vote, please? All those in favour as amended... Oh, sorry, Councillor Shepherd.
It was just a response to Councillor Croft in terms of his principles. I've followed the Nolan principles. I've followed the principles and the behaviour in this chamber for a long time. I abide by rules. What I was suggesting was it would be more open and transparent to have criteria for ex-councillors and for some of this street naming. That's all I was suggesting. You know, and I'm sorry, sometimes the behaviour in this chamber from the other side is not pleasant. So, you know, I'll say it as it is. I've been here a long time now. And I think when you're talking about principles, I've got plenty. Thank you very much.
Like yourself, Councillor Shepherd, and I don't intend to get into political debate, but since you've raised it, I've also sat in this chamber for a number of years. And I have to say that on a personal level, Councillor Shepherd is quite right that I have never witnessed her behave in an unbecoming way. But to tarnish the whole of the Conservative Party with that, when she sat next to someone accusing residents who had concerns about gypsies and travellers brain dead, who shouted across the chamber that we couldn't even spell respect, I think it was, or who actually shouted at us numerous offensive words across the chamber after formal business had finished, or didn't even have the decency when I congratulated, as the then leader of the opposition, everyone for their service of this council, to be told I don't believe a word he says, or to, and it's quite fortuitous because I was just thinking about this, one of your councillors, under their breath, when Councillor Golby had a medical procedure where her jaw was wired, said, shame it wasn't wired shut permanently. I'm not going to take any lectures from the Labour Party on behaviour and etiquette in public life when that has gone unheeded for so many years. I think it's actually a nonsense. I take Councillor Shepherd as an individual example of her own personal integrity, and I do believe that she has personal integrity on that, but I think it's also a shame that a number of her colleagues over the years haven't. Councillor Croft, and then I'll move to the vote.
I should just very briefly reply. I think my point was that we are capable of being objective in spite of the fact that we have political principles. I was referring to the idea of conservatism, socialism. I was not implying that Councillor Shepherd had acted without integrity, and I don't want the words to be confused, so I hope that reassures her slightly.
Okay, so we have the report before us with the amendments I read out verbally earlier. Unfortunately, Councillor Golby won't have heard those, so I don't think you'll be able to vote on this one. But all those who were present in favour of the report as amended, please show. Those against? 1. And we'll take it as an abstention. Okay. Okay, thank you. Just find my papers. That leads us on to any other items. I have 2 other items that I wish to raise. The first is about naming roads, and these have been specifically asked for about Sergeant Valentine and Frank Parsons. They've been asked of me as leader of the council, both at council and this meeting. So I would move a recommendation that we ask the family be written to identify their views on the naming of such roads or renaming such roads, and whether they can identify any new streets or proposals for renaming, and that report be brought back to a future committee of this subcommittee. And secondly, that a report be submitted to Cabinet on renaming the Rowan Ringway, the Jubilee Ringway, in honour of Her Majesty the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. I think it is a shining example of public service from Her Majesty the Queen after 70 years, and I think it would be a brilliant tribute in the heart of Nuneaton Town Centre to Her Majesty the Queen, which will have a long-lasting legacy. I appreciate that we are twinned with Rowan, but we also have a number of other twinned towns that we have. They are not honoured similarly, and I think 70 years on the throne trumps our long association with Rowan. She has been here permanently. Rowan are our friends at a distance, and I think the greater honour is for Her Majesty the Queen. Do those 2 proposals receive a seconder? Councillor Golby, any member wish to speak? Councillor Tromans.
Yeah, with the greatest respect, heartfelt to our friends in Rowan, and indeed all of our twin town, Cottbus and Guadalajara as well. I think, well, I love the idea of renaming Rowan Ringway, Jubilee Ringway. So yeah, I absolutely will be in favour of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tromans. Anyone else? Councillor Golby?
Can we consider calling it Jubilee Way instead of Jubilee Ringway as another one into the hat? Because I know the Ringway is always a source of derision. I mean, I remember Terry Wogan even spoke about the so-called ring road going through the town centre. And yes, it is a ringway, but can we move away from that? Because, you know, it is the butt of the joke.
It is a fair comment. Could we include in the report to Cabinet suggested road naming in honour of the Jubilee? And because obviously you have criteria about them not being named after certain things. Having read the report, making sure that we're not double accounting or double naming, etc. I'm sure that could form a part of the committee report to Cabinet. And given that the Jubilee celebrations are coming up for June, if that could be expedited as quickly as possible so that we could try and tie that in if the Cabinet is to make that decision. Any other comments from anyone? No? So we have those 2 in front of us, one about dealing with the issue in particular of Sergeant Valentine and Frank Parsons, and then the separate item going to which will come back to us as a subcommittee, then the Rowan Ringway item to commemorate the Jubilee go to Cabinet given the urgency of the item. All those in favour of those recommendations, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. I'm not aware of any other items, so I will thank everyone for their attendance and declare the meeting closed and have a safe journey home.